decision was signed quietly, almost suspiciously quietly, but what happened behind those palace walls was anything but small. Because King Charles had just made a move almost nobody inside the monarchy apparently expected, Catherine was being handed sweeping authority over the palace archives, generations of correspondence, private records, household files, restricted historical material, and documents capable of reopening stories the palace might have preferred remained buried. This was not some decorative royal assignment designed for photographs and polite applause. This was trust being converted into power, and inside an institution where access can mean influence, that distinction was enormous. After the authorization was completed, Charles reportedly remained alone with the papers, almost as though the consequences of that signature were only beginning to sink in. The archives contained correspondence, family records, household decisions, ceremonial precedents, and protected historical material, and suddenly Catherine stood directly in the center of the system, controlling who could reach it. She could approve access, examine restricted holdings, oversee preservation decisions, and determine which senior royal offices could consult some of the most sensitive records in royal possession. And that is where this story stops looking administrative and starts looking explosive. Catherine apparently accepted the document without any visible celebration, but one particular clause changed the atmosphere immediately. Collections restricted for years were now falling beneath her authority. She slowed down. She reread it. Because imagine what that actually means. One signature involving an old letter, one decision involving a sealed record, one judgment about who should see what, and suddenly, reputations, family relationships, and even the historical interpretation of previous royal crises could shift. Instead of dramatically demanding that everything be opened, Catherine reportedly asked for the senior archivist, and what emerged next made the entire appointment look considerably more dangerous. Several sealed collections had apparently gone years without comprehensive review by a senior working royal, but there was something even more intriguing, an access register showing repeated interest in the same cluster of protected files from another royal household office before Charles changed the rules. Catherine did not immediately demand those files. Instead, Catherine wanted the register. That detail matters because before opening the mystery, she apparently wanted to know who had been circling it. Charles was informed and said nothing, but silence inside a story like this does not make the question disappear. It makes it louder. Catherine closed the authorization folder and asked who had requested those files most recently. And suddenly this extraordinary transfer of authority had a completely different edge. Controlling history was one thing. Discovering who had already been searching through it was something else entirely. Behind the titles, 4 people were now facing very different consequences. Catherine had gained responsibility almost unimaginable in its sensitivity. Charles had surrendered control over a system he had guarded for years. William was watching a precedent that could eventually affect his own reign. And Camilla was confronting perhaps the most personally uncomfortable possibility of all. Material buried inside palace history could now be examined by somebody outside her immediate circle. William found Catherine before the consequences had fully settled and congratulated her quietly, but apparently there was caution underneath the warmth. As a future king, he understood exactly how dangerous precedent could become. Old decisions, old customs, and old private records can eventually become the evidence through which another generation judges everything that happened before it. Catherine now controlled access to material capable of changing how those precedents might someday be understood. William therefore warned that authority over the archives also meant responsibility for whatever uncomfortable truths might emerge from them, but Catherine did not back away. Catherine made clear that refusing to confront difficult material would make the entire appointment meaningless. This was no ceremonial ribbon-cutting exercise anymore. Every file approved, every request rejected, and every record protected could carry consequences far beyond the archive itself. William paused before leaving and delivered perhaps the most chilling warning hanging over this entire affair. Once certain things are read, they cannot simply be unread. And almost immediately, Camilla received her own notice. That was when the temperature inside this palace story appeared ready to rise. Because the question was no longer simply what Catherine had been given. The far more dangerous question was what Catherine might eventually discover with it. Camilla read the revised procedure twice before setting it beside an untouched cup of tea, and the tension suddenly became painfully personal. The concern was not ownership of dusty records. It was what those records might reveal, how old correspondence could reshape reputations, revive ceremonial disputes, and expose versions of palace history that powerful people had spent years believing were safely contained. When Catherine discovered that several earlier archive requests had been routed through intermediaries rather than recognizable royal names, the mystery deepened immediately. Household officials, private channels, carefully indirect requests, why all the secrecy? Catherine ordered a historical review, and when Charles learned what was happening, even a brief silence appeared loaded with meaning. William noticed it too. Then the ledger began producing the same trail repeatedly, pointing back toward an earlier confrontation that had apparently pushed the entire system toward collapse. Months before the new authority existed, Camila's private secretary had arrived seeking access to a restricted cabinet containing sensitive correspondence. The problem? The claimed verbal authorization could not be matched to formal documentation. The archivist refused to open it. The secretary insisted permission had already come through the queen consort's household. And suddenly, Charles was personally summoned into a dispute nobody seemed eager to explain too loudly. Charles asked 3 questions: who requested access, who approved it, and whether anything similar had happened before. That final question cracked the story wide open. Earlier records suggested other informal attempts had reached towards sensitive material through different household channels, carefully avoiding the direct appearance of a senior royal name. Worse still, someone had reportedly asked whether handwritten annotations could be separated from older correspondence. Those notes supplied context, meaning that removing them could leave future readers with only a convenient fragment of the story. Charles did not accuse Camilla. Charles simply returned the cabinet key and made the position unmistakable. Nothing moved until the situation was understood. Catherine was then brought into the review precisely because Catherine had not been part of the original dispute, and the investigation soon led toward a closed-door confrontation. Camilla wanted to know why Catherine had been handed authority normally buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Catherine wanted to know why unofficial requests existed in the first place. Charles sat between them while William watched, and the atmosphere became suffocating. Camilla finally asked the question beneath everything: did Catherine believe something was being hidden? Catherine refused to turn the review into an accusation, and instead pointed to repeated requests involving the same sealed collection. Then Camilla turned toward Charles with a much more personal wound. Why had authority been transferred without consultation? And why had Catherine been trusted with the solution before any explanation was heard? Charles hesitated, and that hesitation seemed to say more than any carefully prepared palace statement. William then revealed that concerns about inconsistent archival access had existed for months, long before the cabinet confrontation. Camilla looked back toward Charles. Charles removed his glasses, allowed the silence to hang, and finally delivered the answer nobody could soften: the decision stood. But the most explosive detail was still buried inside the authorization. Catherine had not merely received permission to inspect protected history. Catherine could refuse access altogether, demand written justification, require permanent records of who viewed sensitive material, and prevent private household relationships from bypassing procedure. Then the first real test arrived. A renewed application sought the same correspondence, except the explanation had mysteriously changed. Catherine compared the records, saw the contradiction, signed the decision, and wrote 2 devastating words: access refused. No call to Charles, no request for William's approval. The authority was suddenly real. Camilla received the refusal privately, saw Catherine's signature, and asked for the room to be cleared. Later, Camilla told Charles the wound was no longer about archives. It was about trust. Catherine responded by ordering the disputed collection preserved completely, including annotations and related correspondence. And the archivist discovered an older handwritten warning stating that the collection should never be interpreted without its accompanying context. Eventually, Catherine and Camilla met alone. Camilla admitted the deepest fear was not erasing history, but losing control over which pieces might someday define her. Catherine answered that the complete record actually complicated the harsh interpretation Camilla feared, which was precisely why nothing could be separated. A compromise followed. Catherine retained full authority, while Camilla agreed to submit a transparent request under the same rules as everyone else. When the decision became public, commentators argued over power, precedent, and preservation, while headlines reduced the drama to Catherine holding the keys. Charles later explained the deeper principle: royal memory had to survive family loyalties, temporary disputes, and personal fears. Catherine promised the archives would never become personal power. Camilla ultimately followed the new procedure. William understood the precedent being created, and Charles left behind a system built around one uncomfortable idea: the past could no longer belong to whoever was best positioned to control it. The palace might have settled the rules, but the questions buried inside those records were still there, waiting.